The Last of Us Part 2. I figured I'd do my review now that so many things have finally settled down, and now that the Rage Fest Online is finally over. So what do I think of the game? What kind of score would I give it, as this is something that a lot of people seem to care about? And I think, for me personally, I don't see this as a solid 10 out of 10 or 95 out of 100. For me, it's definitely an 85 out of 100. And let me kind of explain why in a few sentences before we get into the meat of the review. I think overall the pacing in this game is something that hurts the campaign, especially on Ellie's side of the story, fairly early on, with a lot of sections that have a tendency to drag, in part due to the gameplay, in part due to the overall level design that does not seem to really stimulate after a number of events have occurred, essentially ending up as a cycle of kill, 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 and kill some more until you eventually are completely bored as a player. Now, there are also definitely moments of writing in this game that end up falling flat compared to the main story of Ellie and Joel and their saga, leading to quite a few secondary characters feeling left out and rather unpolished as compared to the rest of the story that's on display here, which is a real shame because the game shows quite a bit of promise and a lot of heart as it concerns our primary and very loved characters from the first game, but it tends to drag that on for quite a bit for some of the other characters who are not given nearly enough screen time or mindshare for the player to really enjoy them in this world and give a consistent experience across the entirety of the game, which of course ends up hurting the overall presentation. But let's get into this now and see what we can divulge from the rest of the game. So firstly, I wanted to dive into the graphics. We have some really beautiful footsteps in this game that appear to be, at the very least, done via palm or possibly using tessellation, and they can also appear in the snow as well as the beaches section of the game, or pretty much anywhere where there's sand, and they look pretty impeccable and definitely stick around for quite a bit, certainly a lot longer than any of the other games this console generation that we have seen, and this persistence adds to a certain depth of the game that definitely gives it a layer of immersion that we haven't seen before. And you can see this in particular in the sections of the town where there's been a number of footsteps down. Now these in particular are something that looks to be applied before the player even gets into this section, so it's just a part of the world as opposed to being created by the NPCs as they walk around. However, it nonetheless looks really beautiful, and you can see quite a bit of detail in the footsteps being everywhere, and there's definitely certain elements of shading going on that allow a certain number of opacity between elements that make them seem that much more grounded and much more realistic. And the snow effects don't really end there either. There's quite a bit more to it than just the footsteps themselves. As we'll see shortly here, Ellie can make footsteps in blood. She can also deform the snow, which certainly is using some sort of tessellation here. And it makes for an effect that's really quite convincing, and at a level that, while not matching what we've seen in God of War, it certainly ends up looking quite incredible and definitely lends a sense of beauty to the game, again, that we haven't really quite seen in a lot of titles from this generation. It's a kind of attention to detail that only Naughty Dog has really paid to before, and in a lot of ways it's an improvement from what we've seen from their games such as Uncharted, specifically if we're talking about the sand sections in Uncharted 3, which of course on the PlayStation 3 era were pretty, impressive for their time, but of course now we've moved into a new generation that looks, to be much more powerful and certainly has effects that end up making the world look quite beautiful. And you can see there's a lot of depth to the overall effect as well. There's a lot of kind of ruffling happening with the snow, and totally the character displacing the snow around her is absolutely beautiful. And if you actually lay in place for a really long time, you will see that the snow melts around the character as he or she is on the ground, which again is just another kind of attention to detail that you don't see from a lot of developers in this generation. Again, just highlighting the top-notch quality of the graphical artists and those responsible for the physics in the game. Interacting with the different trees also allows the snow to fall off the different branches, as well as shooting them, and in general just walking through various parts of terrain will deform it. Again, just lending a sense of groundness to the game, not seen in a lot of other titles that are apparent out in the world nowadays. And certainly the rendering quality of the engine has taken quite a big step up from what we have seen before. Certainly the physics of the paper here on the map are quite incredible. Again, this is not something we've seen in too many titles in the previous years, and it looks, quite convincing as an effect. Also, the grass now in the game has a lot of 3D effect to it. It's not just a bunch of 2D sprites, and the grass tends to sway in the wind. And again, the level of detail and density of the geometry in this title is just absolutely incredible to behold. There's just so many different wines, so many different types of plants, and everything just looks quite beautiful because of the lighting system that's in effect here. I believe that they use quite a bit of pre-calculated lighting, as well as some ambient occlusion, and also some light probes to give a certain amount of lighting in the darker corners where you don't have a whole lot of light bleeding through, to make it seem that much more grounded. And the water effects in this game are absolutely incredible in their own right, with a lot of separate shaders used to highlight bubbles, as well as to give the water a kind of sheen that's not frequently seen in a lot of titles. And in addition to all of that, there's a good number of water physics effects applied, and while some of them are more on the surface level, and not necessarily deforming a kind of physical water body, they still look quite convincing. And you can see here that as Ellie moves through, there are surface level shader effects happening that allow the water interaction to look quite next gen. And while it's not the best that we have seen from this console generation, we have seen some during the 360 and PlayStation 2 era that potentially match this level of quality, but at the same time it's an effect that beats anything that Naughty Dog has done in the past. And in addition to that, the effects that are present when you're underwater, with bubbles coming off of Ellie's clothing as well as coming out of her mouth and other characters, just again help make the immersion level that much greater than what we've seen in any of the previous Naughty Dog experiences that have come to pass. And as well as the shading effects on characters, in particular the kind of shading that's done for specularity to make the objects look wet, and this applies to characters as well as any additional models in the world. As we'll see as we play through the game, there's water streaming down characters as well as different buildings. That's done quite well. It's crafted really beautifully, again giving that signature look that Naughty Dog is known for the character wetness that we have come to experience in a lot of their titles from the past, and now it's just taken on a whole nother level. And of course the water effects don't stop there. They can apply to puddles, big or small, as we can see in the truck bed here. Again, just making that level of immersion that much higher. But it doesn't really even stop there either, as we see that the ocean simulation in this game has taken on quite a big look, and it's coming up shortly here. But in the meantime, if we take a look at this boat section here, there's also a wake that comes off of the boat's end, and it looks quite convincing as an effect, and again just makes it so beautiful that it's really hard to compare to anything aside from maybe Watch Dogs, which if you played that game you'll notice that a very similar effect there is present. But really what sets it apart from a lot of the previous Naughty Dog titles and other games this generation is just the wave simulation that's apparent here. The water crashing into the rocks and spraying all over the place, as well as the particle effects kind of giving you a volumetric feeling of everything, is just absolutely immaculate. You can also see the way the boat interacts with everything and the way Ellie bobs up and down as she's moving in the boat. She's not static as she's stuck, kind of just, going over wave over wave. And of course, the different shaders that are applied here, creating bubbles on the water surface, and again, the wind just moving particles around and changing direction on you as you're moving through the water, is absolutely top-notch, and some of the best that we have seen in general in any game, period, this or previous generation. And I think it will be a long time before we really see this matched, as it looks absolutely incredible. And of course the cloud rendering, the lighting, and everything just comes together to form a really gorgeous world that Naughty Dog has absolutely just knocked out of the park in this particular release. Now, something else of note is that the characters, the hair effects are, quite stunning, and while they're not something that you're going to necessarily marvel at, they just lend a certain quality to them that is not seen in too many titles. And specifically, if you look at the fur rendering on dogs, on horses, on just about anything that you'll find that has some kind of a fur effect in the world. It looks quite convincing, unlike a lot of the sort of puffy effects we have seen in other games, or a lot of artifacting that's typically seen on fur, even from titles as modern as Far Cry 5, where the fur on these characters just looks really off. Here we have a really gorgeous quality, and I'm not sure how they achieve this, but it certainly looks really stunning and really top-notch. Absolutely just gorgeous and jaw-dropping overall. And this quality that's applied to the dogs is also apparent in the character models as well, as we'll see that there are creases in clothing that are really well defined. We can see the subsurface scattering used on skin to create a realistic kind of light effect that's, you know, apparent as it pierces the skin and gives them a quality that makes them seem very lifelike in general. And the characters don't stick out of the world, they feel very grounded in general. Again, just speaking to the quality that Naughty Dog has put into everything, from the basic models all the way down to guns, and just the way that they look in comparison to the characters, with nothing clipping through at any point in time. The one caveat here is that there are scenes where the motion syncing or lip syncing for characters within the game itself don't quite match up to the quality that we see in cutscenes, which is a bit of a shame, but I guess they had to cut corners somewhere. Now, the grass effects are something that I, in particular, really love because it gives me a feeling of almost Metal Gear Solid 3 back in the day when you were just sneaking through the grass with it waving in the wind. And the grass density is very reminiscent of Crysis 3 even, which, even though it came out for the previous generation of consoles, it was one of the best grass effects that we have seen to date, and I would say that this game absolutely tops that. In addition to that, the glass effects are something that betters Half-Life and even Metal Gear Solid in some ways, adding a certain layer that we haven't seen aside from maybe games like, you know, Star Wars The Force Unleashed, where they used a very specific effect to mimic that. Now, we also have a section with sprites and mud getting onto characters, which is not something that we've seen from too many other titles, and even Naughty Dog themselves haven't used the effect to too much quality in the past. Now it's very apparent here. Now, the overall gameplay, I feel, is something that you'll either love or you'll hate. There's a new mechanic where you are actually able to go prone. Now, the prone mechanic is really useful, as we'll see throughout the gameplay here, because it allows you to do crafting. Again, crafting makes a huge return, and you're going to be crafting quite a few items in this game. I felt like it wasn't really as necessary in the first title as it is here. Here it's really vital to your survival, and without it, especially crafting on the go, you're going to have a generally hard time. Now, because of the way that the new animation system works in this game, where they're using something called motion matching, which allows them to interpolate between various different animation states and potentially hundreds of different animations on the fly, with the game deciding whichever one to select best and then blending between those animations, all of the character movements seem really seamless and really unique. And while I would have loved to have seen a better animation set with a lot more things the character would be able to do, it's not something that is, necessarily a negative, but I do feel like the gameplay could have certainly been improved had they added a few more different kill animations for Ellie, as the combat generally tends to be hide or sneak around your enemies, shoot them in the head, or potentially bash them in with one of your blades. Now, the gunplay overall is solid, again owing due to the fact that there's now a new dodge mechanic allowing you to get out of the way of enemies, and the overall brutal nature of slashing into all of your opponents feels really great. The controls feel fluid, again owing to the fact of the animation system, and in general the guns feel a lot more brutal to shoot because of the sound and because of the way that the impacts make a huge difference. The explosions, as you can see in this game, make a lot of gibs. There's also pieces of the enemy that'll stick to the wall and fall down, which gives the gibs a huge sense of presence and makes them seem that much more realistic, although definitely pretty gruesome. And if you're not a fan of gore, you're not going to have a good time in this game, because it certainly has quite a bit of that. The interesting thing is that the blood from the characters will have a tendency to pool and also spill out of them in different directions, which is very apparent in the snow sections where the blood will actually melt the snow. You also spend quite a bit of time grabbing different characters and slicing into them with your knife. And this is something that I do have a bit of a gripe with in this game, because it seems to me that this is kind of the main way that Ellie kills people. There's not too many other animations for it, and while the animation that you see in play here is one that you'll get a little bit later in the game, and it's one of the first ones you'll want to unlock because it allows you to dispatch your enemies a lot faster. Otherwise, you end up having to sneak up on them and choke them out, as Joel did in the first game, which takes a really long time and leaves you open. Now, the other issue I have is that the only way to really hide bodies in this game is to take people hostage and drag them to a location where they wouldn't be necessarily found by their buddies, as they will start to go into a more alert state looking for people when you just drop bodies all over the place in plain sight. And this is something where I wish that Naughty Dog had created the ability to drag bodies out of the way so that you wouldn't have to deal with stuff like this. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case here, but I guess since this isn't Splinter Cell or Metal Gear Solid, this is not a mechanic that they felt was necessarily needed in this title, and we certainly didn't have it in the first game. But the interesting thing is that sometimes you'll see animations like this, and it lends, a certain quality to the game that is, really kind of autonomous and really bizarre and random, which is both great and not so good at the same time, because it means that you're not always going to see those moments play out. So while it definitely gives a sense of dynamicism to the game, it does not necessarily always come up in combat, which is a bit of a shame, because it would have been great to see all these different animation sets as you play through the title. Now, one of my favorite sections in this game, and by far the most fun I feel like, is the one where you're sniping as Ellie on this boat towards the end of the campaign. Now, this is only really if you put a scope on your rifle, but it makes for such a tactical and fun section that it was hard to really compare it to anything else, because it's one of the few sections in the game where you get to have this much fun, and you ultimately get to finally feel like you're more of the hunter as opposed to being the prey, as you do feel throughout the majority of this campaign. And certainly just being able to take a bit of a breather and apply some tactics to your playstyle is definitely very different. Now, you do have the choice of playing the game more sneakily, as we'll see in here. You can actually avoid a good chunk of the enemies by quite simply going through this section and around, and you'll see in a bit here that there's also an added sense of verticality, because you can actually travel up these little train cars here from the monorail and be able to scope out the area before you go in, and you're also able to just kind of sneak around. Although in this particular area, because you have to go through this building, sneaking is not really an option. You are going to have to dispatch these guys, but again, if you do have the scope on your rifle during this section, it makes for some very interesting gameplay, which you don't really see in the rest of the title, quite unfortunately. And this is an area where my gripes with the campaign really kind of start to begin, because you have these really fantastic Resident Evil-esque boss battles that are in Abby's campaign, and we'll talk about her in a little bit here, but unfortunately these are some of the really highlighted sections of the game that just have a really high pace to them. They're just a brutal kind of experience in general, and this is not something that we really see on Ellie's side at any point in the campaign until really the very end, and it's a huge shame because they're a lot of fun to play and they just flow really well and add a certain element to the story that you otherwise don't see. And while they can be, kind of contrived in the sense that we've seen all this kind of stuff before, especially if you've played any of the Resident Evil remasters that have come up recently, then this is something that'll be quite familiar to you. You're going to feel pretty much right at home here. But the fact of the matter is, it breaks up the monotony of the sort of hide-and-seek gameplay that's generally a staple of the series, with something a little bit more high-octane, a lot more enjoyable, and in some ways, it's just one of those heart-pounding moments that you really don't get in the rest of the series, really up until this point, and so it's a huge kind of letdown for anyone who's a fan to see that these experiences are really only coming up towards the latter half of the title, where you finally see sort of the pacing kind of kick into high gear. And unfortunately, it is only Abby's campaign that has sections that are, a lot more quickly paced and in general feel that much more nerve-wracking to play, whereas on Ellie's side, you're going to spend most of your time ducked down and hiding, as opposed to actually facing off against just absolutely brutal foes that'll test all of your skills, your usage of weapons, quick switching, and just everything in between, crafting on the fly. it puts pretty much all of your skills to the test in a way that the rest of the campaign absolutely fails to do, and unfortunately that is quite the huge letdown within the campaign itself. But at this point I really want to switch gears over to the story itself, which of course starts with the rather unceremonious killing of Joel at the hands of Abby, who's the protagonist slash antagonist for the sort of latter half of the game, and we definitely see her pull no punches when it comes to executing her revenge story here. But unfortunately this is the part of the campaign that really falls flat for me, and I'm going to explain the reasons why. And quite simply it comes down to the fact that her entire revenge story hinges on the fact that her dad was murdered at the hands of Joel, of course, and we see flashback sequences that explain this, and multiple times it kind of is driven home that this was the whole reason for Abby coming out on this revenge quest, and they give us flashbacks of her story where she's hanging out with her father, and we're supposed to start to relate to Abby as, you know, we get to play her story, as we get to experience things from her point of view. Now, unfortunately, this all really fell flat for me, and it may do the same for you as well, because up until this point, we've been in Ellie's shoes, and we've been experiencing the story of hating Abby the entire time in this lead-up, so having us all of a sudden get to witness a retcon story from the first game really doesn't lend any gravity to her story, to her experience. And as much as the writing tries to get us to feel for Abby, tries to get us to understand her character, her background, and ultimately her reasoning for going on this quest, it just doesn't have the weight that Joel and Ellie's story ever did. And part of that is because there's simply not enough screen share or screen time with this character that we end up having, so she doesn't take up nearly as much space in our mind as did Ellie and Abby's story, or Ellie and Joel's story. And this means that when you're looking at the story from this perspective, it just starts to drag, and it drags on for multiple hours without really giving any sort of new information to us. Sure, there are parts of the story that do make sense, and there's certain bits and pieces that are explained, but it's something that if you have half a brain, you could have already guessed by playing the first game, by, you know, just looking back at these characters, and there wasn't really any need to go back and show us these sections because they don't do anything new. And as much as I've come to sort of like Abby's cast of friends over the course of playing with them in this campaign, I can't help but feel that Abby is a character who does not end up redeeming herself. Now, while most people would say that this cast of characters came off relatively flat, I think the writing here is decent enough, or perhaps saved by the voice acting, so that they don't mostly appear as fodder. Unfortunately, quite a few of them do have plot armor throughout certain points of the campaign, but Ellie quickly dispatches most of them as the story goes on. Where I think it really falls apart, however, is in the fact that Abby as a person is shown to be pretty crappy, and the writing seems to show her as being a good person, or they want you to interpret Abby as a good person after seeing things from her perspective, after sort of walking a mile in her shoes, so to speak. But the problem is, even other characters within her group end up calling her basically a piece of crap, because really that's what she is, and she shows little remorse for what she did to Joel, and her entire story of teaming up with a bunch of scars for a faction that, of course, is against the WLF, a group that Abby is with, it just does not have that much weight. It doesn't have nearly as much weight as Joel and Ellie's story ever did, nor does Abby ever really feel like she is doing it truly out of the goodness of her heart. It just feels like a selfish need to repent for her sins. And unfortunately, this is something that just did not jive with me in any way, shape, or form. Because it doesn't give any credence to Abby's character, nor does it really make up for the poor writing to actually sell the story that she's supposed to be a character that we root for in this campaign. What it made me do is it made me kind of hate her story more. It made me hate her as a character more as well. And unfortunately, the problem is that Ellie's story, where she is basically just a ruthless jerk at this point in time, also made me not particularly like her character either, and perhaps that was kind of the point. But the issue is, between all of these sort of negative moments, there are moments that are somber and moments that are just absolutely filled with beautiful scenery that we get to see, with Ellie finally kind of learning to play guitar, something that Joel definitely wanted her to do, which gives her a bit of Joel back in some ways. It gives her a sense of belonging that perhaps she didn't necessarily have before, and finally she has a character that she really likes, somebody who's staying with her, unlike her previous friends that have died or passed away in this rather botched world. But therein really lies the issue, is that it's only really these side moments in The Last of Us 2 that bring some sort of character progression and beauty to the side of the story that otherwise really doesn't exist in the rest of the game. And it's a really missed opportunity in my opinion, because in the first game there were quite a few story moments where we actually did get to see character development happen throughout the gameplay itself, and little bits and pieces that were added or sprinkled on top, just general banter during the game itself, where you would see these characters kind of come into their own. And unfortunately the writing during the gameplay seems to really take a step back compared to what we see in these sort of separate sequences, and especially between the flashback sequences of Ellie and Joel, where we really get to see a lot of heart in this title, and there are little tearjerker moments here and there that just really bring the point home that this relationship between her and Joel was pretty much monumental, and something that unfortunately she doesn't really have with any character, including even Dina, moving forward into this space. But I think the story that was really told here was a story of Ellie coming of age, and it's a story of her becoming an adult, somebody that, you know, we don't necessarily even recognize anymore because she perhaps does not recognize herself. And that to me really kind of speaks volumes, because as a character Ellie's developed quite a bit, even though we don't necessarily get to see it in the story itself, and perhaps in some ways towards the end of her journey she finally came to have a space in this world that she didn't know she had previously. Having come from the sort of end of the first game, she was a character who just definitely wanted to go out perhaps with a bang, or to give something back to the world, because she didn't feel like she had any other place in it. But having come to the end of her journey in The Last of Us 2, perhaps she has finally found a piece of herself, and she has moved on from Joel, no longer needing him to be that guiding light, because she knows who she is now, and ultimately she's an adult who knows exactly what she wants, and she may not have necessarily found her place amongst people, but perhaps that is something that she will seek to do in the next title.